On the 8th of December 1941, deep inside the Imperial Naval Headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Osamu Nagano reviewed the aftermath of Pearl Harbor with profound gratification. As you examine the historical records, you will see a grim tally for the United States. 8 battleships crippled or sent to the bottom, nearly 200 warplanes obliterated, and 2,400 American lives lost, leaving the Pacific Fleet utterly devastated. However, Nagano remained completely oblivious to a looming reality that no strategist within the Imperial Japanese Navy could have ever imagined. Decaying vessels, languishing in America's mothball fleets, were poised to ignite the most formidable maritime expansion ever recorded. In a mere 24 months, manufacturing facilities across the United States would hit production milestones that Japanese tacticians considered scientifically unachievable, deploying new watercraft at a pace so blinding that enemy forces could barely monitor their launch, much less destroy them. This monumental resurgence began with the revitalization of forgotten naval stockpiles, specifically the James River Reserve Fleet, situated near Fort Eustis, Virginia, which served as a sprawling maritime graveyard for rusting World War I relics. While the exact inventory remains a subject of debate, historians estimate that well over 100 of these dormant ships had received only bare minimum upkeep throughout the 1930s due to shrinking congressional budgets. You can picture these decaying leviathans, trapped in a bureaucratic purgatory, considered far too precious to be dismantled for scrap, prohibitively expensive to maintain properly, and generally viewed as entirely irrelevant for modern conflict. Everything changed overnight when the shockwaves of that fateful December morning reached this aquatic cemetery, prompting civilian contractors and laborers from the Norfolk Naval Shipyard to swarm the dormant anchorage. The directives handed down were remarkably straightforward, yet bordered on the absurd. Commanders demanded that every single salvageable hull be restored to active duty without a moment's delay. When crews conducted their initial surveys, they encountered overwhelmingly bleak conditions, discovering submerged engine rooms, hopelessly rusted mechanical components, and ventilation shafts clogged with avian nests, while certain decks even hosted thriving patches of wild vegetation. Despite these horrifying discoveries, immense physical labor yielded miraculous results, and within a few short weeks, these resurrected vessels actually started navigating the waters under their own steam. One of the very first triumphs in this resurrection effort was the USS Bridgeport, a confiscated German passenger liner from 1917, which suddenly began belching thick, dark exhaust from smokestacks that had sat entirely lifeless for more than 10 years. By the spring of 1942, salvage crews had successfully extracted, completely overhauled, and deployed dozens of these neglected vessels back into the theater of operations. You must understand that these were not majestic combat ships, but rather highly critical auxiliary units, tankers, transport vessels, repair platforms, and freighters that supplied an indispensable logistical backbone right at the exact moment the United States critically required anything capable of staying afloat. Meanwhile, a monumental intelligence catastrophe was unfolding in Tokyo, where the significantly under-resourced espionage network of the Imperial Japanese Navy desperately tried to calculate America's true industrial ceiling. Their evaluations, conducted prior to the outbreak of hostilities, estimated that, pushed to its absolute limits, the American workforce could theoretically manufacture roughly 500,000 tons of combat ships and perhaps 2 million tons of commercial vessels per year. On the surface, you might find their analytical framework quite rational, as Japanese strategists meticulously tallied shipyard slipways, projected steel output, and evaluated the pool of available labor. Military attachés recently stationed in Washington had also flooded their superiors with dispatches, highlighting America's apparent industrial lethargy, frequent labor strikes, pervasive racial friction, and a general atmosphere of peacetime apathy, with one specific dossier emphasizing that domestic shipyards operated at a fraction of their maximum capability while employing laborers who vehemently opposed working extra hours. Although those assessments perfectly captured the reality of a nation at peace, they represented a colossal misjudgment of America's capacity to transform under pressure. The analysts in Tokyo fixated on union disputes, completely failing to anticipate that these same labor organizations would universally vow to halt all strikes for the entirety of the armed conflict, just as they observed racial divides, without realizing that the global crisis would forge unprecedented, albeit restricted, defense employment avenues for marginalized communities. Furthermore, whenever forward-thinking intelligence personnel dared to propose higher estimates of American manufacturing power, top-ranking officials routinely brushed their warnings aside. This willful ignorance stemmed directly from the dominant strategic philosophy known as Kai Kessen, the doctrine of the decisive battle, which anchored itself on the assumption that a singular, catastrophic naval clash would terminate the conflict within 12 months, rendering any long-term industrial resurgence entirely meaningless. Shattering all enemy projections, by 1943 the United States was churning out over 19 million tons of maritime craft, an astonishing figure, nearly 10 times larger than what Japanese strategists had declared the absolute maximum. This staggering reality represented far more than a simple analytical blunder. It highlighted a fatal misunderstanding of a democratic society's boundless potential for unified mobilization. At the heart of this industrial miracle was the United States Maritime Commission, which morphed virtually overnight from a sluggish New Deal administrative body into the supreme director of the most massive shipbuilding campaign in human history. Under the leadership of Admiral Emory S. Land, a man who masterfully navigated both complex engineering principles and labyrinthine government bureaucracy, the agency operated on a single unwavering mandate: construct new vessels faster than the enemy could send them to the ocean floor. Granted sweeping wartime jurisdiction, the Commission ruthlessly seized private shipyards, rationed essential materials, dictated workforce placements, and synchronized a massive manufacturing network, executing a logistical ballet that proved just as devastating to Japanese ambitions as the actual warships themselves. The cornerstone of this mass manufacturing triumph was the Liberty Ship Initiative, which heavily adapted a straightforward British blueprint for cargo freighters to establish an entirely new paradigm for standardized mass assembly. As you examine the schematics, you will notice the deliberate integration of outdated mechanisms, such as utilizing older reciprocating engines over advanced turbines, and favoring simple linear shapes over intricate curves, specifically to ensure that entirely green workforces could assemble them with blinding speed. To illustrate the dramatic acceleration of this process, the very first Liberty vessel, the SS Patrick Henry, splashed into the water on the 27th of September 1941, following a lengthy construction period of 244 days. Yet, driven by an incredibly steep and relentless learning curve, assembly times plummeted below 100 days by the early months of 1942, with some exceptionally efficient shipyards eventually completing entire hulls in fewer than 50 days before the year concluded. Beyond merely securing raw materials and blueprints, the Commission aggressively tackled the severe manpower shortage by launching intensive educational initiatives capable of turning landlocked farmers into competent sailors in a matter of weeks. They drastically condensed the Merchant Marine Academy's rigorous curriculum, slashing the required study time from 4 full years down to a highly accelerated 18 months. By the time the global conflict finally ended, they had successfully educated over 250,000 fresh maritime operators, effectively summoning a civilian naval force vastly superior in size to Japan's entire seafaring population. This astonishing human achievement perfectly complemented the visionary methodologies introduced by Henry J. Kaiser, an industrialist who entered the naval sector without a shred of maritime background, yet revolutionized the field by applying techniques he had perfected while constructing massive hydroelectric dams. Kaiser's incredibly effective philosophy was remarkably straightforward: fracture impossibly massive undertakings into easily digestible chores, push simultaneous assembly to its absolute limit, and heavily invest in the well-being and efficiency of the everyday worker. At his sprawling Richmond, California facilities, which eventually encompassed 55 shipways in total, industrialist Henry Kaiser radically overhauled maritime construction by introducing sophisticated assembly line techniques. Instead of constructing vessels sequentially from the keel upward, as you would typically see in traditional shipyards, Kaiser's workforce manufactured enormous ship sections concurrently across different locations. For instance, massive bow components were fabricated in one area, while stern sections took shape in another, allowing fully equipped deckhouses to be completed off-site before being hoisted seamlessly into their final positions. This revolutionary approach extended directly to the workforce, where a severe shortage of seasoned shipbuilders prompted Kaiser to redesign the labor process entirely, rather than compromise on quality. He elected to train highly focused specialists instead of well-rounded craftsmen, ensuring that a welder might master only a single type of joint, but could execute it flawlessly thousands of times. When logistical bottlenecks threatened production, Kaiser rapidly erected supporting infrastructure, building entire municipalities to solve housing crises, establishing 24-hour nurseries for childcare, and founding the medical network that ultimately evolved into Kaiser Permanente. By the middle of 1942, this relentless elimination of obstacles allowed Kaiser's yards to churn out Liberty ships at a staggering pace, ultimately producing over 700 vessels from the Richmond complex alone during the conflict. You can trace the necessity of this immense industrial surge back to the strategic paradox of Pearl Harbor, an attack that achieved tactical brilliance but rested on catastrophic long-term miscalculations. The operations architect, Admiral Yamamoto Isuroku, had lived in the United States and grasped its staggering manufacturing potential far better than his superiors, anticipating only a brief 6-month to 1-year window of Japanese supremacy. Although the immediate devastation appeared to vindicate Japan's aggressive strategy, the assault critically bypassed essential infrastructure, leaving Pacific Fleet carriers untouched, alongside vital repair facilities, fuel depots, and submarine bases. More importantly, the bombardment instantly galvanized a previously fractured and fiercely isolationist American public into a unified, highly motivated juggernaut. Citizens, who might have naturally resisted grueling labor demands, suddenly volunteered for double shifts, labor unions voluntarily halted all strikes, and women poured into the industrial workforce in entirely unprecedented numbers. The resulting statistical explosion perfectly illustrates this monumental societal shift, with vessel deliveries accelerating every single month throughout 1942 as existing facilities optimized their systems and laborers honed their new skills. By the midpoint of that year, American manufacturing hubs were routinely accomplishing feats that Japanese High Command had dismissed as sheer impossibilities. Monthly Liberty ship completions skyrocketed, from 5 in January to 14 in March, climbing to 33 in June and surging to 67 by September, eventually hitting a staggering peak of 106 vessels, more than 3 ships a day, in October 1943. When neutral observers reported these massive fleets gathering in Atlantic harbors, baffled Japanese intelligence analysts frantically rationalized the data, suggesting the Americans were double-counting Great Lakes freighters or simply fabricating the numbers outright. They could not accept the staggering logistical reality that coordinating the seamless, uninterrupted delivery of thousands of tons of steel, multiple engines, and countless components from hundreds of scattered suppliers represented an organizational triumph as formidable as the vessels themselves. Simultaneously, the reactivation of older reserve fleets provided indispensable logistical support, utilizing mobile repair ships and fuel tankers to keep the advancing Navy operational across vast ocean distances. Japanese submarine commanders positioned on the front lines became the most direct, albeit frequently ignored, witnesses to this terrifying expansion of American naval dominance. While officers, like Commander Kanashi Takazu of the I-19, achieved remarkable early victories, such as the September 1942 sinking of the USS Wasp, their subsequent patrol reports detailed increasingly impenetrable defenses. By 1943, launching assaults against American convoys had devolved into practically suicidal endeavors, as industrial abundance flooded the Pacific theater with heavily armed escort carriers, relentless destroyer patrols, and continuously upgraded radar and sonar technologies. Consequently, the once feared Japanese submarine fleet was largely relegated to desperate supply runs for isolated island garrisons, transforming former hunters into the hunted, who merely sought to avoid detection. This immense shift prompted one bitter Japanese commander to observe that the Americans seemed capable of launching a new warship for every single ton of rice harvested in Japan. Back at the zenith of the shipyard ecosystem, facilities like the Richmond complex operated around the clock, perfectly embodying this overwhelming industrial momentum. The prefabrication methodologies had reached an astonishing level of sophistication, allowing colossal bow sections weighing over 200 tons to be manipulated as single units, while stern pieces arrived with their propeller shafts already integrated. Fully outfitted deckhouses, complete with intricate electrical wiring and plumbing, were systematically dropped into place, coming together on the slipways like a massive, three-dimensional puzzle. Driving this entire operation was an incredibly diverse workforce, prominently featuring a groundbreaking influx of minority laborers and female workers, whose numbers comprised 25 to 30% of the personnel in certain shipyards. Even though systemic prejudices endured and widespread equality was still distant, the global conflict unlocked numerous manufacturing roles that had historically been inaccessible to marginalized populations. You could find that, despite the typical laborer possessing barely 12 months of training, their overall output rapidly eclipsed the benchmarks set prior to the hostilities. The underlying logistical networks proved just as phenomenal, featuring extensive rail systems transporting essential supplies alongside colossal, custom-engineered lifting equipment that effortlessly hoisted burdens veteran naval architects had deemed impossible to move. All the while, fabrication facilities, metal casting plants, and construction zones functioned in perfect harmony. Within the highest echelons of the Japanese High Command, an understanding of their impending downfall surfaced at varying intervals, yet the psychological trajectory remained remarkably uniform. Following their early triumphs, a creeping skepticism eventually gave way to the abrupt realization that achieving victory had become a numerical impossibility, a shift catalyzed by the devastating loss in the Marianas during June 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, famously christened the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by United States aviators, showcased an unparalleled tactical dominance, with Task Force 58 deploying a greater number of aircraft carriers, dreadnoughts, and support vessels than the whole Imperial Navy possessed before the conflict began. As their airborne maritime forces were utterly decimated, sacrificing over 400 planes while eliminating fewer than 30 American fighters, the commander of the combined fleet, Admiral Toyota Soimu, subsequently confessed that this catastrophic engagement solidified his certainty of their ultimate failure. The United States had essentially forged an armada that their adversaries were powerless to confront, provisioned by maritime logistics networks they were unable to destroy, and bolstered by a manufacturing sector they simply could not rival. By the concluding months of 1944, the emergence of B-29 strategic aircraft in the skies above the Japanese home islands, launching from newly captured airstrips in the Marianas, rendered this overwhelming industrial advantage terrifyingly obvious to the general populace. Although defending interceptors struggled immensely to climb to the cruising heights of a B-29, their attempts to disrupt these aerial assaults were almost invariably futile. Every single one of those sophisticated, high-cost, yet endlessly replicated flying fortresses served as a flying testament to the boundless production capacity of the American nation. The technological progression of cargo vessels continued unabated, so even while the iconic Liberty ships were flooding out of the dry docks, the United States Maritime Commission was already aggressively deploying crucial upgrades. The newly designed Victory ships successfully resolved the inherent flaws of their predecessors without sacrificing the vital benefits of rapid, assembly line construction, ultimately proving to be more robust, highly streamlined, and profoundly swifter. This enhancement in velocity was absolutely critical. Whereas the maximum pace of an 11-knot Liberty vessel left it perilously exposed to underwater predators, the Victory models could comfortably cruise at 15 to 17 knots. This impressive swiftness was more than adequate to outpace any surfaced U-boat, simultaneously slashing overall transit durations across perilous oceanic routes. Furthermore, critical refinements in the external framework eradicated the structural vulnerabilities that had previously led to dangerous fracturing in the hulls of early transport models. The pivot in manufacturing highlighted an extraordinary national flexibility as vast shipyards transitioned their operations from the older blueprints to the advanced Victory class, with virtually zero interruption in their schedules. Laborers seamlessly absorbed novel fabrication methodologies while sustaining extreme output volumes, meaning that by mid-1944, these superior freighters were rolling off the line just as rapidly as their rudimentary ancestors once had. Ultimately, more than 500 of these formidable vessels were launched, with many remaining in active commercial service for decades following the cessation of hostilities, thoroughly proving that high-volume production, when expertly administered, did not require compromising on excellence. Beyond the metal and rivets, the demographics of the dry docks reflected a profound societal metamorphosis as women successfully undertook heavy industrial duties, such as welding steel plates, driving rivets, and manipulating heavy machinery that had long been deemed beyond their capabilities. Simultaneously, African American citizens secured unprecedented footholds in specialized trades that had historically been gate-kept, even as they navigated the heavy burdens of lingering racial prejudices. The revolutionary strategies championed by industrialist Henry J. Kaiser expanded far past the slipways, fundamentally reshaping civilian welfare through a pioneering prepaid medical infrastructure designed to guarantee maximum physical health and relentless output among his staff. To further sustain this relentless pace, 24-hour pediatric facilities were established to nurture the offspring of the workforce, ensuring the production lines never paused. Massive residential initiatives spawned entire municipalities practically instantaneously, vividly illustrated by Vanport City near Portland, which swelled to accommodate over 40,000 inhabitants during its zenith, briefly cementing its status as Oregon's second most populous urban center. You must realize that these extensive community frameworks were never intended as philanthropic gestures. Rather, they were coldly calculated financial expenditures aimed directly at maximizing industrial efficiency. Management understood that a robust employee was a fruitful one, that parents, unburdened by daytime obligations, could confidently staff the midnight rotations, and that personnel residing adjacent to their stations wasted 0 hours in transit. Every conceivable logistical or personal obstacle that threatened to slow down the relentless assembly lines was systematically isolated and thoroughly neutralized. The resulting surge in manufacturing throughput was nothing short of astonishing, characterized by a persistent drop in the required labor per vessel as the personnel honed their expertise and administrative protocols were refined. By the twilight of 1944, assembling a standard cargo transport demanded merely 1/3 of the grueling hours it had consumed back in early 1942, representing a fundamental reinvention of manual labor rather than a mere uptick in speed. As the calendar turned to 1945, the brutal arithmetic dictating an Allied triumph had become an absolute certainty that no Axis commander could ignore. The sweeping operations to liberate the Philippines clearly showcased the capacity of the United States to deploy staggering levels of military might across any chosen theater in the vast Pacific expanse. The amphibious assault groups now comprised hundreds of warships, all tethered to colossal logistical convoys that spanned the entire breadth of the ocean. During the horrific clashes at Iwo Jima, the density of explosive ordnance unleashed by American forces surpassed any previous benchmark in the annals of human conflict, with the opening artillery barrage expending a greater volume of munitions than the entire arsenals of many sovereign nations. Similarly, the invasion force gathered at Okinawa swelled beyond 1,400 ships, constituting what was almost certainly the most massive maritime congregation ever witnessed in history. In a final, agonizing gambit to force exorbitant casualties through coordinated suicide strikes, the Japanese kamikaze initiative managed to secure isolated tactical victories, yet it ultimately proved utterly inconsequential to the grand strategic picture. Although the desperate aerial onslaughts sent dozens of Allied vessels to the ocean floor and severely damaged hundreds more, these catastrophic tolls, which would have unquestionably paralyzed military campaigns in any prior era, were effortlessly swallowed by the American manufacturing behemoth. This unparalleled industrial output meant that every casualty was swiftly substituted without causing even a ripple in the broader operational momentum. By the scorching summer of 1945, United States naval fleets were maneuvering with a luxurious surplus of resources that would have been dismissed as pure fantasy just 4 years earlier in 1941. Crippled destroyers were rapidly patched up and sent back into the fray. Sunken cruisers were instantly succeeded by fresh hulls, and the sheer numerical disparity became an insurmountable wall for the opposing forces. The spectacular devastation of the atomic detonations that ultimately concluded the global conflict often overshadows a profound historical reality. The Japanese Empire had already been thoroughly crushed by the sheer weight of conventional manufacturing warfare. While the nuclear strikes hastened the formal capitulation, they were not the root cause of the enemy's downfall. That fate had been irreversibly sealed amidst the sparks and steel of American dry docks. Between December 1941 and August 1945, the nation's builders successfully launched over 5,000 commercial transport vessels, accumulating a staggering capacity of more than 50 million deadweight tons, whereas their Pacific adversary managed to assemble only a microscopic fraction of that tonnage. The United States was literally constructing more maritime assets in a span of 30 days than the opposition could muster over multiple years. And this staggering asymmetry was further compounded by the fact that every new American vessel integrated relentless technological advancements. As production volumes surged, the standards of quality control simultaneously advanced, ensuring that innovation remained a constant force throughout the mass manufacturing process. This potent synthesis of immense scale, superior craftsmanship, and relentless refinement created an obstacle that the opposing forces simply could not overcome. By mastering the intricate art of logistics, Admiral Land's Maritime Commission effectively engineered the Allied triumph. American shipyards launched new vessels at a pace far exceeding the enemy's ability to destroy them, while fresh personnel completed their training much faster than the opposition could inflict casualties, ultimately securing a victory dictated by sheer industrial mathematics. You will find that interrogations conducted after the conflict illuminated how the Imperial Officer Corps slowly awakened to the inescapable reality of their impending downfall. While their initial triumphs appeared to justify their operational doctrines, every subsequent clash demonstrated a growing American might, contrasted against a deteriorating Japanese military machine. A high-ranking commander outlined a grim, chronological descent, noting that the initiative vanished following the clash at Midway, and all forward drive evaporated after the grueling campaign at Guadalcanal. By the time the guns fell silent in the Marianas, the broader conflict was effectively forfeited. The struggle for the Philippines left them merely anticipating their demise, and the bloodbath at Okinawa reduced them to hoping for a swift conclusion. Domestic awareness of this impending ruin naturally trailed behind the military's realization, yet the civilian population inevitably arrived at the same grim conclusion. State-sponsored broadcasts relentlessly pushed fabricated triumphs, even as urban centers were reduced to ash. But the relentless B-29 bombing campaigns, devastating coastal bombardments, and suffocating submarine cordons shattered any remaining illusions. By the spring of 1945, the vast majority of the populace silently acknowledged their utter defeat, even if social pressures prevented them from speaking this truth aloud. Clinging to futile defiance against such overwhelming numerical disadvantages was no longer a viable military strategy, but rather a catastrophic delusion that cost hundreds of thousands of lives, ultimately making the atomic detonations a convenient pretext to finalize an outcome already cemented by American manufacturing might. When you evaluate the broader historical legacy of this era, the awakening of the dormant naval reserves and the resulting explosion in shipbuilding showcased a collective power that entirely defied conventional martial metrics. Unified democratic populaces proved capable of orchestrating staggering logistical campaigns that autocratic regimes fundamentally lacked the vision to execute. Pioneering assembly methodologies, such as standardized prefabrication, modular construction, and highly specialized labor roles, profoundly reshaped worldwide manufacturing paradigms for generations to come. At the same time, imperial intelligence networks failed not in their data collection, but in their analytical processing, as deeply ingrained cultural biases and inflexible strategic dogmas blinded them to the true scale of the threat. The opposition could easily tally the number of warships, yet they completely failed to comprehend the massive socio-economic engine generating them, prioritizing battlefield maneuvers while remaining completely ignorant of the underlying supply chains. The fundamental disparity between the two belligerents could not have been more pronounced, pitting Japan's refined combat techniques, seasoned mariners, and fierce spiritual resolve against America's staggering manufacturing base, administrative genius, and unyielding statistical dominance. In the brutal arena of mechanized global conflict, factory output vastly overshadowed individual bravery, supply line management eclipsed battlefield maneuvering, and raw mathematics conquered ideological fervor. This profound misjudgment by the imperial leadership was not a mere lapse in reconnaissance, but a catastrophic failure to grasp how rapidly a democratic society could pivot its vast resources toward a unified wartime objective. They observed the sluggish nature of a peacetime economy and mistakenly projected those inefficiencies into a combat scenario, equipping themselves for a series of decisive skirmishes while the United States mobilized for an unrelenting war of attrition and mass production. The narrative of restoring the reserve armada and the subsequent explosion of industrial output clearly illustrates the true mechanism behind the Allied triumph in the Second World War. This monumental victory was forged not merely amidst the chaos of spectacular oceanic engagements, but within the deafening roar of steel mills, sprawling shipyards, and bustling training facilities scattered across the continent. Visionary leaders like Henry Kaiser did far more than construct vessels. They completely reimagined the global manufacturing process. The innovative methodologies they pioneered, along with the profound social transformations they championed, including the integration of women and minorities into skilled labor and the introduction of employer-sponsored healthcare, forever altered the fabric of American society and established the foundational principles of modern logistical science. When you consider the human element of this global struggle, it reveals a profound tapestry, woven from both staggering achievements and profound sorrow. While domestic laborers orchestrated unprecedented manufacturing marvels, the opposing military forces fought with immense bravery against an enemy armed with insurmountable statistical advantages. Civilians across all involved nations bore the horrific burdens of the conflict, yet the final resolution was dictated by sheer factory output rather than traditional martial heroism. These historical truths remain incredibly pertinent today, as massive industrial infrastructure continues to be the bedrock of any credible military force, dictating the scope of strategic possibilities and proving that unified democracies harbor a staggering mobilization capacity that continually astounds those who misjudge their civilian nature. The antiquated hulls that sailed out of their peaceful moorings in 1941 delivered far more than mere munitions across the Pacific Ocean. They served as undeniable evidence that a commerce-driven republic could transition from dormant complacency to overwhelming martial supremacy with a velocity and magnitude that shattered all previous, quicker than the imperial forces could eliminate them. This profound shift did not simply secure a military triumph. It completely redefined the nature of armed conflict, permanently closing the chapter on localized, decisive engagements and ushering in the terrifying new epoch of total industrial warfare. The imperial nation absorbed this harsh reality through a truly catastrophic subjugation, watching the seemingly unconquerable domain of December 1941 crumble into complete devastation by August 1945. They were ultimately vanquished not by clever battlefield stratagems or superior individual valor, but by an overwhelming deluge of manufacturing prowess that transformed the Pacific theater from a contest of arms into a foregone mathematical conclusion. In a fascinating twist of historical irony, the post-war resurrection of the Japanese state relied heavily upon the very same operational philosophies that had engineered their defeat. By wholeheartedly adopting American assembly line techniques and mass manufacturing principles, they evolved from a shattered military empire into a dominant economic titan, beautifully illustrating that the same industrial forces utilized to conquer nations could be equally effective in securing lasting prosperity. Ultimately, the saga of the American Phantom Armada transcends mere naval vessels, illustrating a fundamental evolution in the very nature of armed conflict. The conventional metrics of military strength are rendered entirely inadequate the moment a democratic nation fuses its manufacturing might with collective resolve, elevating mass production to the level of grand strategy. By returning to active duty in 1941, those previously mothballed warships accomplished far more than simply securing a global triumph. They served as undeniable proof that within contemporary combat, industrial facilities hold as much critical weight as active war zones, demonstrating that manufacturing operations rival the importance of combat formations and that mathematical output ultimately dictates the victor.